He thought he adopted a dangerous German Shepherd. What the dog did next shocked everyone. The shelter smelled of bleach, fur, and something sad. Caleb Monroe barely noticed. His boots scraped the linoleum floor as he moved past row after row of kennels, each one lined with the desperate, hopeful eyes of dogs who had forgotten what grass felt like. Some barked, others whimpered, and a few simply stared. Not begging, just resigned. He wasn't here to adopt, not really. Not in the way most people were. He wasn't a family looking for a playful companion or a retiree seeking comfort. He didn't even know what he was looking for. Just something. A presence that might fill the heavy silence of his small house, maybe. Someone to sit with in the long evenings. Someone who didn't expect much talking. He reached the last kennel before turning around, and that's when he saw him. Tucked in the shadowed corner of Kennel 41B. The dog didn't bark, didn't move. Watched. A German Shepherd, broad-shouldered, tense, his black and tan coat dulled under the flickering light. There was a red tag clipped to his gate that read, "Aggressive, not to be handled." And below that, a name scratched in faded black marker. Brutus. Caleb crouched slowly, staying back. The dog's eyes followed him, wary but sharp, alert in a way that said he hadn't given up. Not entirely. Caleb recognized that look. It mirrored what he saw in his own reflection most mornings. "Buddy," he murmured, "you don't look like a Brutus." "He's not adoptable," came a voice from behind. A shelter tech, arms crossed, already shaking her head. "Came in from a seizure case. Used to be a guard dog or something. Never socialized. Failed all the temperament tests. We've had him 4 months, and he hasn't let anyone near him." Caleb stood. "He ever snap at anyone?" "No, but he growls. Won't eat when people are around, sleeps with one eye open. He's broken. People would just put him down. We've been buying him time." Caleb looked again. The shepherd's ears twitched at their voices, but his eyes never left Caleb. There was no snarl, no raised hackles, just stillness, calculating stillness. "I'll take him," Caleb said. The woman's brow furrowed. "You ex-law enforcement or military or something?" "Marine," Caleb replied. "Dog handler." She sighed. "That explains it. They made him sign a waiver just in case. Funds, no returns, and absolutely no promises." "Don't expect gratitude," the woman warned as she handed over the leash and papers. "He doesn't bond. He just endures." Caleb knelt by the kennel door, letting the leash drag on the ground. "Not asking for much," he said, "not to her, but to the dog. Just need a little silence, same as you." Slowly he opened the gate. The dog didn't move. Caleb didn't reach for him. He just stood and turned, walking out with the leash in hand. For a moment, nothing happened. Then behind him, soft steps. The dog followed. He renamed him Shadow. It wasn't just for the color or the way he moved. Low, quiet, nearly invisible at times. It was because he followed at a distance, always just behind Caleb, never too close, but never too far. At home, Shadow paced the perimeter of each room like a soldier clearing a building. He didn't bark, didn't whine. Even lie down unless he was in a corner, back to the wall, eyes always on the door. Caleb gave him space. He didn't push affection. No commands, no pressure. The first week, he barely acknowledged the dog except to feed him and offer a few calm, quiet words. He moved slow, no sudden gestures. He left the back door open when he worked in the garage, just in case Shadow decided to bolt. But the dog never left. He hovered nearby, watching, as if waiting for the catch. Weeks in, the growling stopped. By the third, Shadow began to sleep. Not deep sleep, not yet, but sleep nonetheless. Curled in the corner of the living room, chest rising and falling slow, head resting on his paws. And then, one morning, Caleb felt something strange against his thigh as he sat on the porch, sipping his coffee. Shadow had leaned into him, just barely, his weight tentative. But it was a lean, a contact, a choice. That was the first day Caleb cried since returning home. On grew in silence. Walks at dusk, shared stillness on the porch. Caleb read aloud sometimes, poetry, mostly, which surprised even him. Shadow would watch the birds, unmoving, ears perked like he was listening too. He still didn't play. but he stopped flinching at sudden sounds. He stopped sleeping with one eye open. Then Brian Keller showed up. It was a Tuesday, sunny and warm. He had just come back from the vet's with Shadow. Annual checkup, clean bill of health, when a silver SUV pulled into the driveway. A tall man in his 50s stepped out, a smug smile on his face. "That's him," the man said, pointing. "That's my dog." Shadow froze. Then, in an instant, all the progress unraveled. He backed behind Caleb, growling low, his body language reverting to that rigid, haunted posture from the shelter. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Who the hell are you?" "Brian Keller." "Dog's name is Brutus. I've got the paperwork to prove it." They argued. Brian produced a folder with faded ownership papers, photos from 3 years ago. Caleb studied the images. Same eyes, same scar above the left paw. It was Shadow, no doubt, but in the photos the dog looked different. Harder, eyes dull, almost glazed, like he'd been hollowed out. "I've been looking for him," Brian said, fake sympathy lacing his voice. "He was taken from my property during an animal welfare raid. Mine. Legally." Caleb didn't hand him over. He refused. Later, he dug deeper. A friend in animal welfare pulled Shadow's old file. What he found made his stomach twist. The dog hadn't been trained. He'd been broken, starved for submission, choked with prong collars, locked in dark kennels, beaten for noise. Shadow had been a prisoner. Caleb filed for legal ownership. Brian filed back. It went to court. The trial was ugly. Brian wore his Sunday best and smiled like a saint. The dog was misunderstood, spirited, but never abused. His documents were real but outdated. Caleb had witnesses, the shelter staff, the vet, even a canine behaviorist who testified to Shadow's psychological healing. He had photos, before and after. He brought a video of Shadow peacefully resting at his feet during a thunderstorm. But none of that compared to what happened in the courtroom itself. When Brian walked in, Shadow growled, low, cold. Walked, unprompted, to Caleb's side and laid his head on his boot. The judge paused. He stared. Then he delivered the ruling. Ownership transferred. Permanently, for the welfare of the animal. Brian stormed out. Shadow never looked at him once. Caleb thought that would be the end of it. But a week later, a woman appeared at his door. Her name was Angela Carter, and she held a photograph of Shadow. Only in her photo, his name was Chance. He'd been rescued from a dogfighting ring. Had fostered him. He'd vanished one night when a rescue transport went wrong. Caleb called Shadow to the porch. Angela knelt. "Chance?" she whispered. Shadow froze. Then slowly he stepped forward. He sniffed her hands. For a moment, Caleb's heart ached. But then Shadow turned and went back to Caleb, sitting beside him. Angela smiled. Guess he made his choice. So Caleb knelt too, arm around the dog who was once Brutus, then Chance, now Shadow. A dog nobody had wanted, once trained by pain and reclaimed by kindness. "You're not mine," Caleb whispered, "but I'm yours." And Shadow leaned in. The days following the courtroom victory settled like dust after a storm, quiet, still, and oddly fragile. Caleb kept expecting something to happen. Maybe Brian would appeal. Maybe Angela would return with a second claim. Maybe the fragile peace he'd built would crack again. But nothing happened. Life simply continued. Something different in the way Shadow moved now. He was still cautious, still alert, but no longer haunted. When Caleb rose in the mornings, Shadow was already at the back door, tail slowly wagging, ready for their walk. The leash lay forgotten on the hook most days. Shadow didn't need it. He stuck to Caleb's side with the kind of loyalty you didn't train. It was chosen. Mid-afternoon, as amber light filtered through the trees, Caleb sat on the porch watching Shadow chase the wind. Not a bird or squirrel in sight, just the wind. He'd leap, bark once, then spin in a circle like a pup who didn't realize he wasn't young anymore. Caleb smiled, setting down his mug. The warmth in his chest was new. It wasn't the kind of happiness that burst in fireworks. It was quieter, more like breath after drowning. This morning, Caleb decided to do something he hadn't in years. He took out the old file, his own. Military records, deployment photos, a badge from the K-9 unit tucked behind an envelope he hadn't opened in over a decade. He pulled it out, fingers trembling. The handwriting was his own, shaky and smudged. a letter he had written to himself the night before his final mission. He had planned to read it when he got home. He never did. Home had looked different when he returned. Partner, Rex, had died in the field. There had been a blast, and the last thing Caleb remembered before waking in the hospital was the sound of Rex barking, warning him, shielding him. He hadn't worked with dogs again after that. Couldn't. Until Shadow. He looked up from the letter and saw Shadow sitting in the doorway, head tilted, watching, like he knew something had shifted in Caleb too. That evening, Caleb took Shadow to the open field just past the woods. Quiet place, a remnant of an old farm where the fence posts were more memory than structure. Shadow roamed freely, nose to the ground, tail flicking side to side. Caleb sat on a stump and pulled a tennis ball from his coat pocket. "You want to try?" he called, holding it up. Shadow looked at the ball, then at Caleb. Suspicious. Caleb rolled it across the grass. Shadow didn't chase it. He trotted up, sniffed it, then looked back like, "Is that it?" Caleb chuckled. "We'll work on it." The next few days, they returned to that field. Caleb brought different toys. A rope, a squeaky chicken, a frisbee. Shadow ignored them all until Caleb brought out an old Kong, one he'd found buried in a bin in the garage. It still smelled faintly of peanut butter. When he tossed it gently, Shadow didn't just trot over. He ran, and then he picked it up. He didn't play, not exactly, but he carried it around like something sacred. Caleb saw it then, not just memory, but recognition. In his broken past, Shadow had known toys like this. Maybe not as Brutus, maybe not even as Chance. But before the pain, before the abuse, someone had shown him what it meant to be a dog. That night, as Caleb sat on the porch with Shadow at his feet, he whispered a quiet question. "What was your name before all this?" Shadow didn't answer, but he lifted his head, nudged Caleb's knee, and sighed. 2 days later, a letter arrived. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Words. No handwriting. Just a warning. He won't stop. You think you won, but Keller doesn't lose. Watch your back. Caleb read it 3 times before folding it and tossing it into the fireplace. He didn't tell anyone, not the police, not Angela, not even the shelter staff who had supported him during the trial. If Brian wanted to threaten him, he'd have to do more than send letters. But even as the flames devoured the page, something inside Caleb stirred. Not fear, alertness. Kind that never really left him after the service. The next day, he reinforced the locks on the back door, added cameras to the porch and motion lights along the fence. Shadow watched him work, lying in the grass like a sentinel. That night, Shadow didn't sleep in the corner. He curled up at the foot of Caleb's bed for the first time, and Caleb didn't stop him. A week passed, then another, and still no sign of Keller. Caleb started to believe maybe it was over, until the engine noise came. Late, nearly midnight, and the sound didn't belong to any of the usual neighbors. Slow, rumbling, deliberate. Caleb turned off the TV and walked to the window. A black truck idled at the curb, lights off. The silhouette of a man sat behind the wheel, unmoving, watching. Caleb's hand found the bat he kept by the door. He didn't step outside, but he stood there, framed in the porch light, arms crossed, gaze steady. Shadow padded up behind him, growling low. The truck pulled away. No plates. Lights just vanished into the dark. The next morning, Caleb went into town. He stopped by the sheriff's office, not to report, just to make a quiet inquiry. Sheriff Langston, an old friend from school, narrowed his eyes at the mention of Brian Keller. "He used to run with some shady groups downstate," Langston said. "Animal fighting rings, illegal breeding. Maybe worse. Thought he cleaned up after the bust last year." "He didn't," Caleb said simply, "and now he wants the dog back. For love, for revenge." Langston leaned back. "You want protection?" "I want you to know, in case something happens." The sheriff nodded. "You call me if you see that truck again." Caleb did one better. He installed a GPS tag on Shadow's collar. Not because he thought Shadow would run, but in case someone tried to take him. Shadow hated it, kept pawing at the new addition like it itched. But Caleb insisted. "You get lost again," he muttered. "I'm coming for you." That night, as they sat in the dark with the fire flickering, Caleb opened a new book to read aloud. Shadow lay at his feet, eyes closed, but ears twitching with every word. It was peaceful. sacred. A silence earned, not given. And when the wind shifted, carrying the faintest whiff of motor oil and something burnt, Shadow's eyes opened. He stood. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He just stood. Caleb followed his gaze to the dark beyond the window. Nothing moved. Not yet. Something was out there, watching, waiting. The past, it seemed, wasn't done with either of them. But this time, they weren't alone. This time, the shadow had someone standing in it. Caleb reached down and placed a hand on the dog's head. "Let him come," he whispered. "We're not running." Shadow didn't flinch. He simply sat down, steady and silent, ready. The next morning began in eerie quiet. The usual rustle of wind through the trees behind Caleb's cabin was absent, as if the forest itself had paused to hold its breath. Even the bird song was missing, replaced by a stillness so complete it made Caleb's skin crawl. He stood on the porch, coffee in one hand, his other resting instinctively on the sidearm he'd worn like a second skin during his deployments. Sat beside him, upright and tense, not looking at Caleb, but scanning the tree line beyond the clearing like he was waiting for something to emerge. Caleb didn't ask what. He trusted Shadow's instincts more than his own. After a long moment, the dog relaxed slightly and turned his gaze toward the horizon. But Caleb didn't. He had learned the hard way that danger doesn't always come charging out of the dark. Sometimes it waits, bides its time, slips in through cracks too small to see. The memory of the truck returned, black, silent, watching. And though it hadn't come back since, the message was clear. This wasn't over. Caleb hadn't spent years learning how to read terrain, how to sense ambushes, how to trust gut and pattern only to ignore it now. He moved back inside and grabbed the burner phone he kept for emergencies, dialing a number he hadn't used in over 2 years. It rang once, twice. Then a gruff voice answered. "Didn't think I'd hear from you again," the man said. "Didn't waste time. I need eyes on Keller. You still got people downstate?" A pause, then, "You think he's moving on you?" "He's circling. I need to know how many friends he's bringing." "I'll make some calls. You got backup?" Caleb looked down at Shadow, who was now pacing the living room with deliberate steps, checking each window, tail stiff like a drawn bow. "I've got the best." By noon, the wind had picked up again, but it carried an edge, a sharpness Caleb recognized from the desert winds of Kandahar. It wasn't the cold. It was the way the wind moved, urgent and warning, as if it wanted him to get underground. He spent the afternoon preparing, restocking the emergency kits, rechecking the hidden cameras, testing the satellite uplink that ran independent of cell service. The safe house protocols he had once drilled into his unit, he now applied to the cabin. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. Shadow trailed him, ever present, occasionally nudging Caleb's leg to remind him he wasn't alone in this. Around 4 p.m., the call came. The same voice as before, now edged with tension. "Your guy's not working alone. He's got 2 vehicles, a storage unit full of supplies, and a known associate. Nathan Yates, ex-private military, shady history, tied to black market canine trades." Caleb's blood went cold. "Keller's trafficking dogs?" "Not just dogs, canines. Hired units, ones with value." The weight of the realization hit him like a gut punch. "Shadow," he muttered. They weren't trying to get him back because they missed him. They were trying to sell him. A pause on the line. "There's more. The storage unit had paperwork, photos, you and Shadow. They've been watching you." "I figured." Caleb hung up. He didn't need confirmation to know a war was coming, but now he understood the stakes. It wasn't just a piece of property Keller wanted to reclaim. He was a product, a commodity in an underground market where pain had a price and obedience came through cruelty. Caleb had seen those markets in war zones. He never imagined one would follow him home. That night he didn't sleep. Neither did Shadow. They sat together by the fire, but the warmth didn't reach them. Caleb loaded his weapon slowly, methodically. Not for show, not for fear, for readiness. His mind ticked through possibilities, defenses, escape routes. But there was no thought of running. Shadow lay stretched beside the hearth, eyes half closed but ears flicking at every creak of the floorboards. Sometime around 2 in the morning, Shadow rose. Not abruptly, not with fear, but with certainty. He walked to the front door, sat, and stared at it. Caleb followed, opened the door. The night was ink dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through bare branches. Then, a sound. Not tires on gravel, not footsteps. A low electronic whine. Caleb's eyes darted to the motion sensor by the woods. The light was blinking. Someone or something was moving. Caleb clicked the safety off and stepped outside, Shadow close behind. The field beyond the cabin stretched into open brush bordered by thick pine trees and silence. Caleb moved like a ghost, boots soft on the cold earth, weapon at the ready. Shadow stayed to his right, scanning with his nose and ears. Reached the tree line. Stillness. Then, a crunch. Left side. Caleb pivoted, gun raised. A shadow flickered and vanished. Another sound behind them, metal on stone. They were being tested, watched, herded. "Come on," Caleb whispered, backing toward the cabin. But Shadow froze, his body tensed. His head turned slowly toward a stump on the edge of the field, eyes locked. Caleb followed the gaze and saw it. A small black device, blinking. A camera, motion activated, hidden in plain sight, and recorded, tracked, possibly for weeks. Caleb yanked it free and crushed it under his boot, the snap echoing too loud. Then a voice, distorted, amplified, called from the trees. "He doesn't belong to you." Caleb raised his weapon. "Then come take him." Silence. Then footsteps. Multiple. Retreating. They weren't ready to engage. Not yet. This was a warning. Caleb and Shadow returned to the cabin. The dog didn't sleep again that night, neither did Caleb. Caleb sent a message to his contact. "They're close. Moving soon." The reply came instantly. "You want help?" Caleb typed 2 words. Not yet. But in truth, he didn't know how much longer he could stand alone. The next 2 days were spent in preparation. Caleb trained with Shadow again. Drills, hand signals, emergency response. He was surprised how quickly the dog remembered. It wasn't just training, it was muscle memory, instinct. Set up decoys, dummy cameras, traps that only someone with experience would recognize and avoid. It wasn't to hurt them, it was to see how smart they were, how far they'd come. And one night they did come. It was almost dawn when the lights cut out. All of them. Every bulb in the house, the porch, even the backup generators. Caleb snapped awake, already dressed, already armed. Shadow growled low, but didn't bark. Instead, he moved to the back window, tail stiff, body low. Followed, heart hammering. Through the faint gray of pre-morning light, figures moved. 3, maybe 4, coming from different angles. Coordinated. Caleb didn't panic. He breathed deep, slow, tactical. "Shadow," he whispered. The dog turned, eyes like molten steel. Time to show them. And in that moment, everything clicked. The training, the years of loss, the broken pasts of both man and dog. They weren't prey anymore. They were a unit, a team, and no one was taking them apart. And the first blow didn't come through the door. It came through the glass. A brick, heavy and wrapped in duct tape, shattered the kitchen window just before dawn. Caleb didn't flinch. He'd been expecting it. What surprised him wasn't the break-in, but the boldness. Whoever was behind it wasn't just trying to intimidate anymore. They were crossing the threshold. They were declaring war. Crouched low beside the island counter, eyes scanning the shadows outside the broken window, while his hand moved with precision, releasing the safety on his sidearm, checking the chamber, signaling silently to Shadow, who was already positioned at the back hallway, ears flat and eyes glowing with focus. A second sound followed, the rattle of the side gate, metal against metal, and then the muffled scuff of boots on the porch. He knew better than to shoot blind, so he waited, body still but coiled, breath shallow, heart rate steady like a metronome. Shadow didn't growl. He didn't need to. His presence in the house had become something more than protection. It was warning enough. Then came the voice again, low and taunting, from outside the kitchen. "You don't know what you're holding on to, Monroe. That dog's not yours. He's property. Valuable property." Caleb didn't respond, not with words. Reached into the drawer, pulled out a small remote, and pressed the button. Instantly, floodlights lit up the perimeter of the house like stage lights, catching the figures creeping through the brush in stark relief. There were three of them, all dressed in tactical black, faces masked, weapons drawn. Professionals, not thugs. And they froze as the light hit them, squinting and raising their arms instinctively. That moment of hesitation was all Caleb needed. Opened the back door just wide enough to let Shadow out and gave the single command he hadn't used in years. Guard! Shadow didn't need to be told twice. He exploded from the doorway like a bullet, not barking, not making a sound, his entire body a streak of muscle and purpose. The men outside reacted too late. One turned to run, the other raised his weapon, but Shadow was faster. Barreled into the lead intruder with full force, knocking the man to the ground and clamping his jaws onto the attacker's wrist with surgical precision. No wasted movement, no fury, just control, training. The third man fired a shot, wild and too high, and Caleb answered it with a return round that struck the wooden post beside him, deliberately missing. Next one hits, he called out. You walk away now or you don't walk at all. For a second, nothing. Third man dropped his weapon and raised both hands. We're leaving, he shouted. Call your dog off. Caleb didn't lower his weapon. Shadow off. The dog released the attacker immediately but didn't retreat. He stood over the man, chest heaving, watching, waiting. The man on the ground groaned, cradling his wrist, and tried to scramble backward. Caleb stepped outside, weapon still aimed, and kicked the intruder's discarded gun into the bushes. Keller, this is over, he said, his voice low and final. He comes back. He won't leave. The three attackers didn't argue. They fled into the woods, disappearing as quickly as they had come. Caleb stood in the yard for a long time afterward, watching the tree line, Shadow at his side. When the sun finally rose, bleeding through the gray like gold through ash, he turned to the dog and whispered, You saved us again. Shadow didn't wag his tail. Just sat, solemn and steady, as if he too knew this wasn't a victory. It was a delay. That morning, Caleb filed a formal report. Sheriff Langston arrived with deputies and took statements, gathered shell casings, and photographed the scene. But there was little evidence to track. No prints, no license plates, just footprints scattered and panicked, leading into the woods. You sure you don't want to relocate? Langston asked, his voice heavy with concern. A friend up north who could keep you both safe until this blows over. Caleb shook his head. We're not running. That's what he wants. The sheriff didn't push. He just nodded and said, Keep the dog close, as if Caleb ever did anything else. Over the next few days, the cabin became quieter, heavier. Caleb worked in the garage during the day, adding new locks, reinforcing doors, installing motion sensors that triggered silent alarms instead of lights. Never strayed more than a few feet from him. Even inside, the dog followed room to room, his body always between Caleb and the nearest window. The bond they shared was no longer built just on healing. It was now forged in fire. But the tension wore at them. Caleb could feel it in his shoulders, in the way he checked the doors 3-4 times each night. Shadow slept less and less. He paced, stood by the windows, ears twitching at every sound. Tried to soothe him, sitting beside him at the hearth, murmuring quiet words of comfort. But he knew the dog could sense the storm wasn't over. And then, 3 days after the attack, Angela returned. She didn't knock, just stood at the edge of the yard, hands in her coat pockets, eyes full of something Caleb couldn't quite name. Regret, maybe, or apology. Shadow saw her first. He didn't growl, he didn't run. He simply stood and stared, his body stiff. Opened the door and stepped onto the porch. You shouldn't be here, he said. Angela nodded. I know, but I had to warn you. Caleb's eyes narrowed. About Keller? Yes, she said, and more. He's not working alone. There's an entire network. They're buying retired K9s, dogs like Shadow, then reselling them overseas or retraining them for private security in places where laws don't matter. Caleb didn't answer. His jaw clenched. Angela took a breath. A chance back, because Chance, Shadow, was the best. You saw it. He's still got that spark. He's not going back, Caleb said, no matter what it costs. I know, Angela whispered. That's why I'm here. I used to be part of the rescue network that pulled dogs like him out. But when Chance disappeared, I thought I'd failed him. I couldn't protect him, and now I'm trying to make it right. Caleb crossed his arms. How? She pulled a small USB drive from her pocket and handed it over. It has everything. Photos, records, locations of kennels, names of buyers and sellers. If anything happens to me, I need someone who can make noise. Caleb hesitated, then took it. Their fingers brushed, and Shadow, watching from the porch, stepped closer, slowly, until he stood between them. He didn't growl. He just looked up at Caleb, then Angela, then back again, as if weighing them both, choosing. Angela knelt. Hey, Chance, she murmured, her voice breaking. The best dog I ever met, and I'm sorry I couldn't keep you safe. Shadow stepped forward, pressed his nose to her hand, then walked away. Back to Caleb. Angela stood, wiped her eyes. He chose you. Caleb nodded. He did. She turned to leave, then paused. What are you going to do? Caleb looked at the drive in his hand, then at the dog beside him. We're going to finish it. The storm didn't come in thunder or rain. It came in silence just after midnight, when the trees stood too still and even the wind seemed to wait. Caleb sat at the old pine table, the USB drive plugged into his laptop, screen glowing dimly in the otherwise dark cabin. Shadow lay beside him, body tense but unmoving, his ears twitching at every distant creak. The files Angela had given him were damning. Contracts, photos, names, bank transfers. A complete web of corruption tied to Keller and a string of clients stretching across borders. The trafficking ring didn't just use retired canines. They broke them down, reconditioned them with shock and pain, and turned them into disposable tools for mercenaries, black market guards, and worse. And Shadow Chance had once been caught in that cycle. Caleb stared at the files, jaw clenched, fury boiling slow in his chest. This wasn't just about a dog anymore. This was about every handler who'd ever loved their partner. Every soldier who'd watched their dog take a bullet to protect them. The animal turned into a weapon, then discarded like trash. And tonight, Caleb knew Keller would come, because exposing him wasn't enough. Men like Keller didn't run from shame. They destroyed the source. Caleb closed the laptop, tucked the drive into a hidden compartment beneath the floorboard, and stood. Shadow rose too, silently falling into step beside him. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The plan had already been made. The traps were set, the routes were memorized. Had reinforced every door, moved the emergency supplies into the storm cellar, and laid motion sensors at every approach point. If they came, they'd be seen before they touched the porch. And if they made it to the house, they'd meet fire. Caleb strapped on his vest, faded, old, but still functional, checked his weapon, and gave Shadow one last long look. If I fall, he whispered, you run. You don't look back. Shadow didn't blink. Simply sat down, unwavering, as if to say, you're not falling. Not tonight. And then the first alarm buzzed. East side, the tree line. Caleb moved fast, killing the interior lights with a switch and slipping to the front window. The faint shape of a man passed between the trees, ufkamang, low and careful, like a wolf stalking prey. Another figure followed, then a third. 3 was manageable. But when the fourth appeared, and then a fifth, Caleb's stomach turned. They weren't here to scare him this time. They were here to finish it. He clicked the safety off his rifle, signaled to Shadow, and moved to the side exit, where the shadows were thickest. From there, he had a clear view of the clearing and the field beyond. The figures spread out, 2 circling left, 2 right, 1 up the center. Textbook formation. They were professionals. But Caleb had trained professionals. He was one of them. He waited until the center man stepped into the wire trap he'd laid beneath the underbrush. A sharp crack echoed through the clearing as the man went down with a howl, his leg ensnared. The others reacted instantly, but Caleb didn't give them time to coordinate. He fired twice, precise and low, hitting legs, not heads. He didn't want to kill them. Not yet. Let them crawl home. Let them remember. Shadow bolted from the shadows like lightning, targeting the man on the left flank. Attacker raised a baton, but Shadow ducked low and took him down with surgical force, jaws locked on the man's wrist until he dropped the weapon. Caleb advanced, covering him, breathing slow and steady. Another shot rang out. From the trees, a sniper. Caleb dove behind a stump, bullets kicking up splinters beside his head. He cursed under his breath. Keller had brought a shooter. Smart, but not smart enough. He'd anticipated this. Tapped his wristband, activating the drone perched in the tree canopy above. The small machine buzzed to life and lifted into the air, scanning infrared. There, third tree from the left, elevated perch, body heat visible. Caleb adjusted his scope, waited for the sniper to shift for a better angle, then fired. One shot. The man tumbled from the branch with a thud. Movement stopped. The remaining attackers began retreating, dragging their injured with them. Caleb didn't pursue. But in the open, shoulders square, weapon lowered. "Tell Keller he lost," he shouted into the night. "Tell him I've got the evidence, I've got the names, and if anything happens to me or this dog, it all goes public." Silence. Then the rustling of leaves as the last of the attackers disappeared into the woods. Caleb lowered his weapon. Shadow returned, panting but unharmed, his tail swaying once like a salute. They had won. For now. Morning, the sheriff was there with backup, surveying the field, collecting the men who'd been too injured to flee. Caleb handed over a copy of the USB drive. "There's more where that came from," he said. "And if anything happens to me, 3 people in 3 different states have the rest." Langston nodded grimly. "I'll take this straight to the state authorities, maybe even federal. This is bigger than just you, Caleb." "I know," Caleb said, "but it started here. It ends here." Days that followed, the media exploded. The story spread fast. A former Marine and his rescued dog fighting off a trafficking ring. Photos of Shadow flooded the internet, standing tall beside Caleb, eyes alert, posture proud. They became a symbol not just of survival, but of justice. Angela returned, this time with reinforcements of her own, a coalition of former handlers, rescue workers, and canine advocates. Together they began tracking down the rest of the ring. Raids followed. Were freed, names were exposed. And Keller? He vanished. Gone underground, hunted now by the very people he once profited from. Caleb didn't care. He wasn't afraid, because Shadow wasn't just a dog anymore. He was a legacy, a message, proof that what's broken can be rebuilt, that what's hurt can still protect. One afternoon, months after the attack, Caleb and Shadow sat in the same field where their story had begun. The wind moved gently through the grass. He held a worn leather collar in his hands, the one Shadow had come with, cracked and scarred. He looked at the dog beside him and smiled. "You were Brutus, then Chance, now Shadow. 3 names, 3 lives, and you're still here." Shadow leaned into him, the same way he had that first day on the porch. And Caleb understood. The dog didn't care about names, he cared about home. And he had found it. Caleb reached into his pack and pulled out a new tag, gleaming in the sun. He flipped it gently onto Shadow's collar. It read simply, "Family." The past would always be there, in scars, in memories, in silent nights when nightmares stirred. But so would healing, so would peace, and so would the man and the dog who had found each other not at their best, but at their worst. And somehow that made it stronger. They didn't need a war to prove their bond anymore. They didn't need to run, they just needed each other. And now, finally, they had forever.